Welcome to Reddit Aliens. People who have encountered a serial killer before, how was it like? What was the interaction like? Spoiler, not safe for work. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Have a great day. While I was still doing social work, I was part of a reintegration team with a probation parole. Most of the people we helped were just ordinary people who made bad decisions under stress. I can clearly remember one though that was a rapist murderer that targeted young girls. I can't elaborate further due to concern over my own privacy. Anyway, this guy got away with the rape and murder on a technicality despite admitting guilt, but was convicted of another crime on another technicality and received the maximum sentence of only a few years. That guy was an effing predator. I never turned my back to him, never let him out of my awareness. He was creepy to the point of being inhuman, constantly and obviously looking for vulnerability without any attempt to hide it. I called my mom that night and bawled my eyes out, thinking that I made a horrible mistake becoming a social worker and that this person challenged my own ethics, morals, and belief in rehabilitation. It was my first month as a social worker. OMG, finally something relevant to me. My boys and girls club basketball coach was a serial killer. He was a sweet guy. I really liked him, especially compared to the big and loud and hardcore coach that was always yelling George, seemed sweet and empathic and caring. He also worked at the Nintendo store at the mall, and when my mom and sister and I would go, they would take me to the Nintendo store and ask for George and leave me with him while they went and shopped the mall. He would let me playtest games and set me up on a console in the store, and I'd be there for hours. Turns out, he had lots of family trouble and had issues with women. He would pick them up at bars, take them home, have sex, and then stab them. He'd stab them in really weird ways, like he'd stab in a line and keep going even after getting past their body, stabbing the mattress. Then he'd take their bodies back to the bar and pose them after hours near the dumpster. Obligatory, not me answer, but my sister-in-law encountered Ivan Milat, one of the two men that inspired the Wolf Creek series. She was traveling the east coast of Australia for a few weeks with her brother. One night, her and her brother were having jerky and beer by a campfire when Milat sat down at their campfire. When she first saw him, she thought he was a park ranger because of his style of dress. She thought he was going to tell them that they built the campfire in a prohibited area, but instead, he commented on what a beautiful evening it was, then pointed out some of the notable stars in the sky. Ivan did not properly introduce himself. He just sat down and started chatting. He asked my sister-in-law where she was from, and she told him Darwin. He said, "What's a Darwin girl doing all the way out here?" My sister-in-law explained that she was on a road trip. She seemed to pique his interest when she told him that instead of doing the usual beach vacation, she wanted to do something a little more rugged, like explore caves, do a little rock climbing, and hike trails that were not popular with the tourists. My sister-in-law says that Ivan was friendly, and he had a lot of ideas about places she might like to go, including a cave that had a waterfall inside, which was a bit of a hidden gem not well known to tourists. She felt comfortable talking with him, and when he invited her and her brother to join him at his campsite for some rabbit stew and beer, she would have said yes, but her brother instantly turned him down. Ivan's response to the rejection was a slight, "Well, I tried," shrug of the shoulders. He went back to his campsite, and her brother quickly packed their bags in their rented Land Rover, and they wound up sleeping in the Rover outside a well-lit gas station that night. She said what was so scary about that night is that she felt almost immediately comfortable around Ivan, no red flags whatsoever. He reminded her of one of her uncles that worked construction, one of those rugged but worldly kind of guys, while her brother was immediately suspicious of the charming stranger. She kind of wonders what would have happened to her if her brother had not been there that night. Well, I think that if your sister-in-law was alone in that situation, it could have ended much differently and worse for her. He wasn't technically a serial killer, but a gang enforcer that had multiple murder and assault charges pending. I worked at the courthouse. I'll post anyway since I don't think you'll have a lot of responses. He seemed totally normal. He was young, well-kept, attractive, polite, and personable. He was joking with the sheriffs, and they called him a goofy kid. I'd gotten bad vibes from people who were there for court cases, but I didn't get any weird vibes from this guy at all. No dead eyes, no creepy affect, no weird traits. You'd never know anything was wrong with passing him in the street. He'd gotten put in the system as a juvenile and was released after doing jail time. Then he'd immediately gone to another state, done a murder or two, then came to my state and killed 2 teens. I don't think he was even 20 yet, and he'd killed at least 4 people. I was surprised afterwards when they told me what he'd done. I've interacted with one who was actively killing, but had not been found out yet. He was a good family friend, and I had known him since I was 10 years old. However, my family drifted apart from him because we moved states when I was 19. It turns out he had killed his wife, brother-in-law, mother, and sister, I believe, over a 15-year period. My dad called me to tell me, and I was pretty shocked. I only knew him and his wife, and the story I had in my head was they got divorced and she moved away. But sadly, that was not the case when police found her and others buried on his property. He was like an uncle to me. As a former correctional officer, I've known all types of killers, from gang members to assassins, from heat of passion murderers to those who have killed multiple people. Whether or not the latter would be considered serial or spree killers would depend on the context of the crime. But I've met and known all types for many years. Each one was different. Individual personalities ran the entire gamut. Some were remorseful, some not. Some were very scary and intimidating, and others I wouldn't mind having a beer with. What was interesting, in a correctional environment, you get to know them at a pretty intimate level. Those who are truly psychopathic show this early on, and as a correctional professional, you get to use to being able to see who's really a bad guy and who maybe made a mistake or did something in the heat of passion. Not a serial killer, but in January 2003, a distant cousin of mine that I saw at family gatherings occasionally and who had always seemed pretty normal, 20 SF, got into an argument with her mother over house cleaning, and it turned physical. She overpowered her mother, tied her up upstairs, and kept her there for a day or two. She told her she was going to kill her and let her mother take an overdose of pills. That didn't work fast enough, I guess, so she killed her with an axe. Then went out to dinner with a male friend and invited him to go back to her house to watch TV. Once there, she told him what she did, but he didn't believe her until he actually went upstairs and saw. He convinced her to call 911. She was more concerned about what her own punishment would be, rather than the fact that she killed her own mother. I've never met a serial killer, but I did meet an eventual killer. He was our neighbor for a while, nice to us, but seemed to hate everyone else. Either you were his best friend or his enemy with absolutely no middle ground. Over the years, we found out that his father was in the mob and his mother was a call girl. His father would beat him all the time until one day he was old enough to beat the shit out of him. Left his home and formed a band in the 80s, which eventually led to hard drug use such as cocaine, which might explain his erratic behavior later. They never made it big, and he eventually became a handyman to support himself. Last few times I saw him, he was finally moving out of the house he was scammed on and moving in with his girlfriend. He also was getting back in touch with his mother, and so things seemed to be looking up. Fast forward a few years later, and I see on the news that during a heated argument with his girlfriend, he stabbed her to death. He seemed incredibly remorseful for what he did. It's just a shame that it took a murder to snap himself out of his own head. All that woman wanted was for him to clean up his act, and she deserved far better. I met a man who later killed his wife and 3 of his 5 children before he killed himself. It was before this happened, when he was picking up his son from my birthday party. I remember him, but it was a brief interaction and nothing stood out to me at the time. I was a kid, and he was just my friend's dad. My friend and one of his older sisters only survived because they were not home. The dad had been sexually abusing one of the daughters, and when he found out that she had confided in someone, he killed everyone that was home. Not sure how anyone found out about that being the reason. There may have been a note. This man looked and acted just like anyone else. Granted, that's pretty easy to do for the short period of time I met him for, and my friend never talked about his dad. We lost touch after I moved away. He was completely normal. I taught him grade 12 English and helped him graduate from high school. He was awaiting trial on 3 murders when I worked with him. I think the count is up to 11 now. He laughed, spoke intelligently, worked hard as at academics. He did have a weird smile he would do, but it always directed at the security officer, not me. He was nothing but polite to me. And that's probably what was the most effed up part of it all, looking back. I served in the same army unit with Israel Keyes. I spent a significant amount of time with him between 99 and 2000. He was super quiet and reserved, and loved to effing drink. He was super chill and hung out in his barracks room most of the time listening to Korn and ICP. I think the fact that he was around 100 other soldiers, he couldn't do anything but blend in. But in retrospect, I can see the antisocial tendencies. He really only had 3 or 4 friends from the mortar squad and a handful of others like me. He used to walk around the halls slowly, drunk as shit. Now I know he was probably thinking about the people he had killed up to that point. According to Wiki, he had already murdered a couple of people before he enlisted in the army. Not serial killers, but interviewed several murders from work. One was full-on mental. Ghosts told me to do it. The rest were just like you or me, except for the eyes. They weren't dead or lifeless. They weren't angry or violent. They were just off. Hard to explain. But you look at them in the eyes and you know they aren't like you. It's unsettling. Alright, so this isn't my story. It belongs to my law teacher who had this encounter. Sorry, this is a long one, so there's a TLDR at the end. Just a little bit of backstory. At the time of this particular encounter where I live, Toronto, there were a bunch of missing persons posters going up everywhere downtown. So, one day my teacher, I'll call him Mr. M, was out with his wife and daughter. He was somewhere downtown, and in that area there were a bunch of posters of some missing guy. Mr. M saw an older man in the park they were near walking about with a cart of papers. Immediately he thought that the man with the cart was putting up the posters, as that's what they do or did when you needed to put up posters. As Mr. M is watching this man with the cart, he realizes he's not putting up the posters, rather taking them down. So, of course, my teacher goes to confront this man. As Mr. M approaches, he calls out something along the lines of, "Hey, you can't be doing that." And without making an eye contact whatsoever, the man with the cart replies in a soft, high-pitched voice, the kind that sounds like freighting, like how psychopaths sound in movies. He goes, "Oh no, we won't need these anymore, he's gone. They're not going to find him." So obviously my teacher is already a bit freaked out and just walks back to his family. Anyway, so 4 months go by, and Mr. M has already forgotten about the encounter. One day, however, the man's face is all over the news. So Mr. M turns the volume up, and as it turns out, the guy with the cart was in fact a serial killer. The guy in the poster was one of his victims. Just in case you're curious, not safe for work, the killer's name is Bruce McArthur. He was, and still is I guess, a gay man who used to go around downtown Toronto and lure gay men back to his apartment. There he'd sexually assault them, kill them, and make it even worse, he'd occasionally eat them. McArthur was also a gardener at the time, so he'd end up hiding the victims' severed body parts in his clients' backyards. It's effed up, and he's in prison for the rest of his life. TLDR. One of my teachers met a serial killer in a park who was taking down the missing posters of one of his victims. He only learned he was talking to a killer 4 months following the incident. He's still scarred. I wonder if your law teacher told the police about that incident, because that would be pretty suspicious if you witnessed or heard something like that. But he was brought to justice, so good. I personally haven't seen or met one myself that I know of, but my dad's childhood friend's dad was a made man with one of the 5 families in New York City and was charged in one of the biggest coke busts during the late 80s, money laundering, gun running, and other RICO offenses. Possibility of him killing multiple people is probable. From what my dad said, the guy was extremely nice and loved his family, but you can tell he had a dark side to him, and he's not one to ask too many questions to. Dennis Rader seemed pretty nice, very outgoing. He kept telling us neighbors were calling to say we were abusing our chickens, but he inspected them and everything was fine. I remember him coming by more than once. My dad says he only came by one time, but Dad's timeline was in the fall before he got caught. And I remember him showing up in the summer too, because Mom had me get him some lemonade because it was hot out. After he got caught, we never heard from animal control ever again. Those mysterious neighbors never called after he got looked up. Kinda weird, right? I was told later by someone who'd been talking to Chief Caps that my family was the target he'd been about before he got caught. Can't verify this though. Not exactly the same thing, but I knew someone who killed multiple people with an axe. He was my aunt's boyfriend or husband and father of her youngest child. He was very sweet when we first met, and he used to babysit me all the time. I remember him giving me a lot of hugs, and he loved his stepdaughter, but things went very sour after a few years. He became very abusive to my aunt and everyone close to her. He eventually became a huge drug addict, and that's when he started killing people. I don't remember exactly how many victims there were, but I do know they all happened because of drug deals gone wrong. Also, he lit the house on fire. I was around 8 to 12 when these things happened. I treated a very well-known serial killer near the end of his life at a hospital I worked at. I hate to sound cliche, but that man's stare was bone-chilling in a way I can't really describe. Also, no females were allowed in the room, and we weren't allowed to wear necklaces, watches, bracelets, rings, or earrings into the room. A typical max security inmate patient came with 3 guards. This guy came with 5.5 guards on duty assigned only to him 24/7. He was far beyond a point health-wise that he was a physical threat, but they took no chances. I assume I saw dozens of murderers. We never knew what they were in prison for, but this guy is or was famous, so we all knew. He was in a whole other level from all the rest. Well, I was cellmates in prison with a guy that had killed people. He could have been in there for traffic violations the way he acted. He was very smart, cordial, took good care of himself, and acted like a normal person. Worked his way out of max over the years and earned privileges. Where I was, you really don't ever ask, "What did you do?" or things like that. It'll come up in normal conversation when you're sharing stories during a lockdown or at night. I was telling him about some of my adventures one night, and he brought up some things about his crimes. He was telling me things that I didn't know if they were true or not. The way he told it certainly sounded legit, but if you do know enough time, anyone can sell a good story. When I got out, I looked up one of the cases, and everything he had said was true, and there were a few details that they didn't even have. That was a very surreal moment. I felt like I wasn't even present, and it was some type of movie or scene from a crime show. It lasted about 15 seconds, then I was back. Definitely a crazy moment for me. I saw her in a restaurant when I was 8 out with my mom and dad. She was the aunt of one of my mom's coworkers, and nobody knew she was a serial killer at the time. About 10 years later, she was convicted of poisoning multiple people over a span of many years. They kept exhuming bodies to test for poison until they were sure they had enough evidence to get the death penalty. She was convicted and sentenced to death. I've met more people that knew or met her than I could count. Nobody says they got a gut feeling about her, well, other than the people who hate the food she served them. Back at home, our neighbor had a boyfriend who had been locked up for murder. It was self-defense, but the guy was one of those people who would come off as too nice and extroverted to the point where it was annoying. Even worse, he was intimidating in that loud voice and tone was just uncomfortable to be around. He'd always get into verbal fights and eventually physical fights with our neighbor. My mom never liked because we shared a driveway. He did like my mom and I because of the whole black community mindset, but I don't know, bruh. Just because we're the same reason doesn't mean I like you. Especially when you stab our neighbor in the neck twice next to our house. Not only did our neighbor not file charges against him, but forgave him through the grace of God, which is the dumbest shit I've ever seen in my life. My mom even called her an effing idiot to her face, having this attempted murderer around. The guy, even after that, still wanted to be friendly towards me. Nah, but I will admit that if someone ever broke into our family's house, he would surely take the robber down, but nah, F him though. Here I am, reading through people's responses, and then I realized me, kinda. I was working in a coffee shop in East London in the late 2000s, and a man came in and acted strangely with me, bringing me lilies and performing some sort of weird flirting. He asked if I had a cat or cats before presenting the flowers. I was friendly and gentle with him, and was very young at the time, perhaps 21. He went outside our shop and sat at an outdoor table for a few hours afterwards. After he left, my colleagues told me he was TV presenter Jill Dando's convicted killer, who had just come out of prison after having his sentence overturned. They insisted on taking turns walking me home for a few weeks afterwards. His name is Barry George, and he has been acquitted after a 7-year prison stretch, but unsettling nonetheless. He wasn't a serial killer. He was a sick pedophile who assaulted me and my baby sister and brother. We were 10, 9, and 4 back then. He was even torturing my brother. It took years of rehab for my brother to get past it, but he still panics when someone touches him during his sleep. We thought that he was put into jail, but turned out he was on the run. I don't know the details, but I think Mother lied to us to keep us from being scared that he might haunt us. 12 years later, in 2018, he got caught, and we were summoned to the court to finalize the case. My brother handled it calmly, but I remember how I felt that morning. I felt sick and nauseous, and I didn't want to go. But I had to. The moment my eyes landed on him, I felt pain in my stomach and numb in my fingers and limbs. I remember him mocking us, as if he were sure he was going to win the case. Before we all entered the court hall, he looked at us with a grin of his disgusting face and threatened to kill my mother if she opens her mouth. And I'm pretty sure he bribed the guards because they didn't stop him from saying whatever he wants and stopped me when I attacked him. I launched at him when threatened my mother, and they caught me and threatened me. They would throw me in jail if I do that again. That was a weird reaction from my behalf, to be honest, but I wasn't myself that day. In the court, I sat in an angle that helped me not see his face, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to go through it. He was sentenced for 18 years only though. I'm just glad it's over, but I've never felt so overwhelmed as much as I did that day, and I never want to experience anything remotely close to that again. Not a serial killer, but a murderer. The guy definitely had several screws loose just based on his mannerisms. He would be super aggressive towards women in bars, and he drove 200 miles per hour on the highway with 0 Fs given. He wouldn't even really look at the road, as if it was clear he had a death sentence. He was actually kind of funny, but it was clear that he was just batshit insane, and my friend hung out with him for several nights out just for entertainment. Just a couple of months after that, the local news broadcast that he was arrested for a cold-blooded murder during a robbery from several years back, and the police eventually tracked it down to him. I wasn't really surprised, although I'd never met a murderer on the run before, and I wouldn't have necessarily thought it was him. I was in jail once with 2 multiple offense murderers. Well, technically, we were all in a jail awaiting sentencing. They had been brought in from prison, and their court case lined up with mine. The jail only had a few large holding cells, and these 2 guys were in full shackles in their cell next to mine. They were frightening to say the least, enjoyed intimidating everyone, especially the young guys who they thought would break. When we were put into the transport truck to get driven back that night, the violent offenders were on one side of the transport, I was on the other. They were kicking the wall between us so hard, I thought it would surely break and come crashing down on top of us. It was like everything was a game to them, a violent, deranged game. I'm a little late to the party, but worth a try. Not a serial killer, but I met Ian David Long, a mass shooter in Southern California. I met him a couple of times, as a close friend of mine actually served with him. I certainly never got close enough to know him well, but it was clear he was not a content person. It was pretty obvious he was struggling with some personal issues, most notably depression, but I never thought anything of it. Fast forward 6 months or so, and there he is in the news, killed 13 people in a popular bar I would frequently go to, just down the road from my apartment. One of the people he killed was a police officer I also knew, because he often worked at town events or concerts. Just recently, the video of said shooting was released. It's hard to watch, to say the least. To the friends and family of the victims involved, I don't think titles really matter. Serial killer, spree killer. It's all the same, just a different method. Not good. Was grocery shopping one day and got into line to pay. Dude in front of me was some guy out on bail, pending his trial on murdering his wife. Seemed like a normal everyday dude, but was kind of eerie, being a few feet from someone who, at the time allegedly, but we all knew he did, killed someone. He was actually found guilty just this past week. Didn't even have anything interesting in his cart. I know, not a serial killer, but I still thought it kind of interesting at the time. You could tell everyone knew who he was, and you could tell he knew everyone knew who he was. Yet everyone was trying to just act normal.